The sun was a merciless eye over the parched land as Owen Ford guided his horse toward the dusty outpost. The air shimmered with heat, carrying the scent of cracked earth. His clothes were threadbare, his boots split, and his spirit felt as worn as the leather of his saddle. The last year had stripped him bare. A fever had taken his small herd of cattle, and a failed well had left his ranch gasping for life. He needed supplies to survive the winter, but his pockets were filled with nothing but dust. Owen had been a rancher his whole life, a solitary man who knew the language of the land better than that of people. When he reached the sagging porch of the trading post, he tethered his horse and pushed through the swinging doors. The air inside was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. A few hard-faced men were hunched over a card game, their laughter sharp and cruel. Behind the counter stood Barlow, a man with a sneer permanently etched onto his face. Owen had a long-standing debt with him, one he had no way of paying. Barlow's eyes, small and dark like a rat's, glinted when he saw Owen. "Well, Ford, come to finally settle up?" he asked, his voice slick with false courtesy. Owen's jaw tightened. "I need supplies on credit, Barlow. Just until I can get back on my feet." Barlow let out a harsh laugh. "Credit? Your credit ran dry with that well of yours." He leaned forward, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. "But, seeing as I'm a generous man, maybe we can make another kind of deal." He gestured toward the back room. A moment later, one of his cronies emerged, shoving a young woman forward. She was Chinese, with long, dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Her clothes were tattered, but she held herself with a quiet dignity that defied her circumstances. Her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, were clear and steady. She didn't look frightened, merely weary of a world that had shown her no kindness. "Bought her contract off a railroad foreman last week," Barlow said with a dismissive wave. "Quiet, works hard. Worth more than your debt, but I'll call it even. Take her, and you walk out of here with a clean slate." The room fell silent. The card players turned to watch, their faces alight with cruel amusement. Owen stared from Barlow to the young woman. "She's a human being, not a sack of flour," he said, his voice a low growl. "She's property, and she's my offer," Barlow shot back. "You want to clear your debt or not? Because if you don't take her, I know a few miners who'll pay double and won't be nearly as gentle." Owen's stomach churned. He looked at the woman again. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, he saw not defiance, but a flicker of desperate hope. He knew this was wrong, a line he never thought he'd cross. But the image of her being handed over to the brutal men Barlow mentioned was a horror he couldn't stomach. This wasn't a choice between right and wrong anymore, it was a choice between two evils, and he had to pick the lesser. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Fine. I'll take her." Barlow grinned, untying the rope that loosely bound her wrists. He gave her a rough push toward Owen, who instinctively steadied her. She didn't flinch, just stood silently beside him. As Owen turned to leave, the laughter of the men followed him out into the oppressive heat, a sound that would haunt his conscience for days. He helped her onto his horse, and she settled behind him without a word. They rode away from the trading post, the silence between them as vast and empty as the desert stretching before them. They traveled for miles under the setting sun, which bled across the sky in hues of orange and purple. As dusk settled, Owen made camp by a small, trickling creek. He built a fire and offered her a piece of jerky and his canteen of water. She accepted the water, drinking slowly, but refused the food. Instead, she sat on the other side of the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames. Her face, illuminated by the flickering light, was still and unreadable. Owen felt a wave of shame wash over him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. She gave no sign that she had heard him. He sighed and lay down by the fire, but sleep wouldn't come. He was a rancher, not a monster. What had he done? He watched her as the hours passed. She hadn't moved, a small, still figure against the vast, dark expanse of the desert night. He saw the subtle way she held herself, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. It was a gesture he'd seen before, on the wives of his neighbors. A cold realization washed over him, making his breath catch in his throat. Finally, he couldn't bear the silence any longer. "My name is Owen Ford," he said into the quiet. "You don't have to stay with me. In the morning, I can take you to the nearest town." This time, she turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his across the fire. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear, with an accent that softened her words. "And leave me where? Another trading post? Another man like him?" Owen had no answer. I didn't want to leave you with him," he stammered. "So you took me instead," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, heartbreaking fact. He looked down at his hands. "I was trying to do the right thing, I suppose. I just don't know what that is anymore." He paused, then looked at her again, his voice gentle. Are you with child?" Her stillness was answer enough. After a long moment, she gave a single, slow nod. The weight of his decision settled on him, heavier than any mountain. He hadn't just taken responsibility for a woman, he had taken responsibility for a mother and her unborn child. The next day's journey was different. Owen moved slower, careful to avoid the roughest parts of the trail. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space of uncertainty. When they stopped to rest, he gave her the softest part of his bread and made sure she drank plenty of water. She watched him with those same steady eyes, but he thought he saw a hint of guarded curiosity in them now. When they finally reached his small, weathered ranch, the place looked even more desolate than he remembered. The wooden fence sagged, the barn door hung on one hinge, and a profound loneliness seemed to seep from the very soil. He slid off the horse and then helped her down, his touch careful. "It's not much," he said, gesturing around. "But it's safe." She looked around, taking in the humble cabin and the quiet, empty land. "My name is Mai," she said softly. It was the first time she had offered a piece of herself. Owen nodded. "It's good to know you, Mai." The first few weeks were a delicate dance of unspoken rules. Mai was a quiet presence, moving through the small cabin with a grace that made it feel less empty. She was a hard worker, insisting on helping with chores despite Owen's protests. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, tended to the small garden he'd neglected, and cooked meals from their meager supplies that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in years. She never spoke of her past, and he never asked. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, she suddenly swayed, her face pale. Owen rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. He helped her to a chair on the porch, his heart pounding with worry. "You have to rest, Mai," he said, his voice firmer than he intended. "You can't keep working like this." She looked up at him, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "If I do not work, I am a burden." "You're not a burden," he said, his voice softening. You're a guest. And you're carrying a child. That's the most important work there is." From that day on, a new understanding bloomed between them. He took over the harder chores, while she focused on the house and garden. They began to talk more, sharing small details of their lives. He told her about his dream of raising cattle, and she told him about her village in a faraway land, of the family she had been forced to leave behind after being tricked by promises of a better life in America. He learned she was a widow, her husband taken by a fever during their voyage. She had been sold from one man to another ever since. He was the first person who had shown her any kindness. One evening, Barlow and two of his men rode up to the ranch, their arrival shattering the peace they had built. Barlow's eyes scanned the property, a greedy sneer on his face. "Ford," he shouted. "Heard you got my property looking real comfortable here." Owen stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. Mai appeared in the doorway behind him. "She's not your property, Barlow. Our debt is settled." Barlow's gaze fell on Mai, lingering on her now visibly swollen belly. His eyes lit up with a sickening realization. "Well, now. Looks like the deal included a bonus." That baby is mine too. It'll fetch a fine price at the mining camps. A cold rage, pure and absolute, surged through Owen. He raised the rifle, his aim steady. "You're not touching either of them," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Get off my land. Now." Barlow hesitated, seeing the unwavering resolve in Owen's eyes. He wasn't the same desperate man who had stood in the trading post. This was a man protecting his own. With a curse, Barlow turned his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. When they were gone, Owen let out a long breath. He turned to see Mai looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time, he saw not just gratitude, but trust. As winter approached, the days grew shorter and colder. Mai's time was near. Owen had ridden to the nearest town to ask the doctor for advice, returning with clean cloths and a book on childbirth. He was terrified, but he refused to let her see it. The baby came during a fierce blizzard that buried the ranch in a thick blanket of snow, cutting them off from the world. Mai's labor was long and difficult. Owen stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, and whispering words of encouragement. In the heart of the storm, with only the howling wind and the flickering lamplight as witnesses, a new life entered the world. A small, healthy baby boy. Mai was exhausted but radiant, holding her son close. She looked at Owen, her face soft with a profound, quiet joy. "His name will be An," she whispered. "It means peace." In that moment, holding the tiny, sleeping infant, Owen felt a shift deep within him. The loneliness that had clung to him for years finally dissolved, replaced by a fierce, protective love for the woman and child who had unexpectedly become his family. The ranch was no longer a place of solitude, it was a home, filled with the soft coos of a baby and Mai's gentle humming. Owen worked the land with renewed purpose, driven by the desire to build a future for them. He fixed the fences, repaired the barn, and his small herd began to grow. Mai, a natural mother, cared for An with a love that was a wonder to behold. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, a family forged not by blood, but by circumstance and